Our story begins with Naaman, the commander of the army of the king, a great man in high favour with his master. This is one important man. Think 4-star general, head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, decorated for military victories, in favour with the king, one of the inner circle. But Naaman, though a mighty warrior, suffered from some kind of skin disease. A mighty warrior, but infected with a disease so devastating that his skin seems to be rotting from its bones. Next in the story is a slave carried off from a raid in Israel. Mighty warriors were accustomed to such booty, gold, silver, chariots, horses, and slaves. They could have what they wanted. And this particular slave girl, who of course is nameless, has been carried off from her home and now serves Naaman's wife. She is as small as Naaman is big. The power he has is the power that she lacks. And yet she is not silent. She says, if only my Lord were with the prophet who is in Samaria, he would cure him of his leprosy. Now, why did this young girl care about this man whose army had carried her away from her own people? That's one question, but here's another. Why did Naaman and the king listen to what the slave girl said? The text doesn't tell us such things, only that the king gave Naaman permission to go. So Naaman departs with lots of gifts and a letter of introduction from his king. But when the king of Israel reads the letter, he is distressed to the core. Am I God, he says, to give life or death, that this man sends word to me to cure this man of his leprosy? It doesn't occur to the king that he wasn't the centre of things. This is between kings. He thinks the king of Aram is trying to trick me, and when I can't cure this man, he's going to declare war on me. But then enter into our story Elisha the prophet. Stop tearing your clothes, he tells the king. You're not the only one around here, you know. Send the man to me so that he may learn that there is a prophet in Israel. With that, the king drops out of the picture, his clothes ripped to shreds. And the mighty warrior and his chariots and his horses and his gifts of gold and silver head to Elisha's house. Now, this is a great scene in the story. Elisha doesn't even come out of the house. He sends his servant with a message for Naaman. Go and wash 7 times in the Jordan, and you will be clean. Well, Naaman isn't used to this. He's a man with authority. He's accustomed to speaking with kings. Who does Elisha think that he is? And Naaman has certainly no intention of washing in the muddy Jordan River. Are not Abana and Pharpar, the rivers of Damascus, better than all the waters of Israel, he says. If Israel's prophet is going to insult Naaman by not even coming out to meet him, then he can at least insult Israel's river. And with that outburst, he turns for home. And that would have been the end of it, except for the servants, who are also nameless. They are horrified with their master's behaviour, and they say, Father, if the prophet had commanded you to do something difficult, wouldn't you have done it? How much more then when all he said to you was, wash and be clean? They know how to get to their master. Of course he'd do something difficult. He's done many difficult things before. After all, he's a mighty warrior. So surely he's brave enough to wash in a muddy river. And so Naaman turns around and goes down into the Jordan and immerses himself 7 times as instructed. And when he came out of the water that last time, he looked down at his hands and his feet, and his flesh was like the flesh of a young boy. But none of those servants said, I told you so. They just took him home. That version of the Naaman story is by the Reverend Barbara Lundblad from the United States. And it highlights for us how much this story is a tale of the powerful and the powerless. The military commander and the kings, in the end, turns out to be the powerless ones. And the slave girl, the servants, and Elisha the prophet turn out to be the powerful. They turn out to be the ones whose power is in the way that they speak, with simplicity and with truth. The powerful, the ones in control, had trouble listening and they were just talking past each other. The powerless offered their service and their advice, despite owing their masters no loyalty whatsoever. They modelled humility and simplicity as the path to healing and grace. Naaman was a commander in Syria around 850 BC. 2,800 years later, we hear his story alongside the images in our mind from television and websites of other commanders in Syria and Iraq, bringing violence and destruction on their people. Naaman's slave girl, taken as a booty of war, even has a modern-day equivalent, an American woman, Kayla Mueller, taken captive and possibly married off as the booty of war, and sadly killed recently in Iraq. She wrote a heartfelt letter to her parents last year, and she said, "I have learnt that even in prison, one can be free. I have learnt that even in prison, one can be free." This was the attitude of our unnamed slave girl as well. She chose to be free. She chose to offer to help Naaman, her captor. The way to healing, the way to peace, is never through violence and more violence. It's through humility and simplicity. We come on Wednesday to the season of Lent, the 40 days leading up to Easter. The 40 days hold within them a tradition of fasting and prayer and self-reflection and almsgiving. We will begin on Ash Wednesday with an ancient ritual of marking our foreheads with ash. It's a sign of sorrow and mourning. The ash would be a symbol that Naaman and Elisha were quite familiar with. It's that old. We will use the ash to make the sign of the cross on our foreheads, reminding us of the sign marked on our foreheads at baptism, and reminding us of our mortality. "Remember you are dust, and to dust you shall return," are the words that we will hear. It's an earthy, grounded beginning to the 40 days. And then we're encouraged to spend a bit more time than usual in listening and prayer and reflection, hence our Lenten program of preachers and discussions. And we are encouraged to fast. Some people give up coffee or alcohol or chocolate, or watch their spending and consumption levels during Lent. And that's because it's a way of saying, these things don't have control over me. Like Naaman, who could control a whole army, but not his health. We can say, I am not controlled by my consumption of these goods. And every time I crave that coffee or that drink, I remember those who have less than me and who could not dream of buying a coffee a day or 4 coffees a day. And so I can pray for them, or I can put my coffee money aside to donate to their needs, maybe to the needs of refugees somewhere. And then we give alms. We give to those in need. We could double our grocery take for the city mission. The Anglican Mission Board has provided envelopes for us that are on the back table for their Lenten appeal. Many other places could benefit from our Lenten discipline. And why in particular do we do these things for these 40 days? Well, because we always have. Because it's healthy to take stock and to reflect in a focused way But we don't have to then keep it up all year, although you never know, we might pick up a habit that we keep. And we do it also in these 40 days because it prepares us for Holy Week. It slows us down, quietens our hearts and minds, so that when Holy Week comes, we're more ready for the journey to the cross. And then when we come to Easter Day, our celebration is all the more joyful. But faced with our media headlines and the growing conflicts in our world, how do we get from that personal level of Lenten focus and humility, how do we get from there to the issues that we're worried about in our world? How do we get from there to have any influence at a global level where our modern day Naamans are wreaking havoc across the Middle East? How do we possibly connect those two things? How do we bring what we know to be simple and true to the table, like the slave girl did? Well, there are voices speaking out. There are voices saying that at least in New Zealand, maybe we should not be involved in military action in Iraq. Christian World Service released a challenging statement this week around that. It's worth looking up. They point out that we could spend the money that we might spend on troops on humanitarian aid, which we certainly should. But then when we see such violence and such huge destruction and the incredible level of the violence that we're seeing at the moment, it is hard to hold back and to not say, well, we must respond with more military might. And so we need a conversation about that. We need a conversation about that in the political realm, but a conversation that is not so much political, but really helps us as a country look at our options. And as citizens of our nation, we get to participate in that conversation. Whether it's amongst ourselves or whether it's lobbying our politicians, we are able to be part of that conversation. And it can be a conversation which has within it the humility and the simplicity of Lent, because it has been shown so many times to be the only way to healing and grace. So whether we're working at our own individual life this Lent, or whether we have the opportunity to participate in something in our society or in something at a higher level, wherever we're at, wherever those conversations are at, we are invited this Lent to live with humility and simplicity as we seek God's healing and grace for ourselves and for our world.